ahead and get started. Um, Before we even hop into the presentation, good evening. Just want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Dr. Karl Bourne Jr. I am a physical therapist located in the Miami area, so South Florida. And I currently work in the outpatient orthopedic setting. I do some work here where I currently am at an outpatient cash pay clinic that also is a hybrid Pilates studio. And then I also have another outpatient orthopedic clinic that I am currently working at. A couple years ago, I got into Pilates, and at the time, wasn't really sure if it was something that I thought would be beneficial in the long term. But I went through a comprehensive program, did all of my hours, observation, practicing, teaching, et cetera, and then sat for my NCPT exam. So those are the credentials that you see on the screen. And then I also went through and did part of the TPI certification a few years ago as well. And so I like to kind of blend my Pilates interventions on kind of helping golfers, improving, their performance, helping them as well, just from a rehabilitative standpoint. And then on the flip side, I also have a tennis performance trainer cert, and I do some work with some tennis players as well, some other athletes, and also, just normal everyday people that they're not necessarily coming from an athletic background, but they still have certain musculoskeletal conditions, and I use the Pilates equipment when feasible, and when it's warranted to be able to kind of help them get better results as well. So with all that being said, we will go ahead and hop into the presentation for today. And from core to clubhead, how Pilates boosts power and performance in golf. So this presentation is going to explore just the impact that Pilates can have on golfers and just kind of emphasizing that connection that can come between the two. My hope is that after this presentation, you walk away thinking like, oh, that's super cool. I want to try that. And you think that you get some benefit from it. And hopefully you're able to kind of incorporate some of these things with your patients, with your athletes, and get some good results. So let's dive into it. So some objectives of this presentation, in case you didn't see the little blurb on the website prior. Number one, we're going to describe how some of the principles of Pilates apply to golf-specific movement patterns. We're going to identify some of the common physical limitations in golfers that can be addressed through targeted Pilates exercises. We're going to demonstrate some of the key Pilates-based movements and modifications that support swing mechanics, rotational power, and injury prevention. And then lastly, we're going to discuss how integrating Pilates into a golfer's training program can improve performance, reduce pain, and promote longevity in the sport. So, why does this matter for us? Well, according to Link Magazine, which is a pretty reputable magazine in the golf world, there are some numbers that are indicating that golf has just really grown vastly throughout the last couple of years. In fact, over the last 5 years, there's been a 16% increase in on-course golfers. So there's a lot of hype around golf right now, and it's kind of been trending that way for the last couple of years. And even I saw some information that said even in 2000, like the incline of just popularity of golf just continues to trend up. Even when it kind of levels out, it's still overall over the last decade, 2 decades, it just continues to grow. You can equate a lot of that, at least in the first part of the 2020s to the pandemic, right? And COVID. I had a lot of people that they say, I didn't really golf until COVID. I didn't really pick it up until post-COVID. And so, I think just that being stuck in the house and having to kind of find some things to do, a lot of people started kind of getting into golf and being able to do stuff in their backyard and things of that sort. So this is important to us as clinicians because we'll have a lot of people coming into the clinic that no, they may not be a professional golfer per se, but they like to use golf as one of their recreational activities. It's something that is important to them. And so whenever they're coming in dealing with whatever ailment it is that they're dealing with, you know, it's up to us to be able to kind of understand you know, from a golf standpoint, just movement patterns, things that we should be looking at, things that lead to some of the injuries. That way we can kind of get ahead of the curve and help provide them with the best quality of care that they're looking for. So, starting off with the components of the golf swing, we're going to look at a couple of the different phases. Now, in the literature and in a lot of different articles, the consensus on the phases of the golf swing are these first four here: the setup, backswing, downswing, and follow through. Now, the setup also you may hear it referred to as the address, right? That's also common terminology that's used. And essentially, that's exactly what it says. That's just the phase where you're preparing to go into the entire motion of your swing. So this is where your grip is made sure that it's proper. This is where you kind of make sure you get in that nice 5-iron golf stance. And then from here, we go into our backswing, where the golfer rotates the body, storing energy for the upcoming downswing. So if you think about it, this is kind of the part where all of that energy that's being stored, it really has to come down through the downswing to be unleashed through acceleration once the golf club is at a horizontal plane and it makes contact with the golf ball going in through the follow through phase, which is more of the deceleration that happens in the golf swing. So, something that we see a lot is that there is this notion of proximal to distal kinetic chain work as far as the golf swing goes. And that's kind of why I put this little picture here with the dominoes, because you kind of think when one domino falls, the rest kind of follow, right? And it just is a good way to kind of think of the way the kinetic chain happens with golf, with the more proximal musculature kind of being the catalyst for the start of the swing and the transfer of the energy from the hips, pelvis, through the core, through the arms, and through the club head, and then reversing back down through the downswing and follow through phase. And then there's also key muscle activation that is important. We're going to kind of look at some of the studies that, or one of the studies that kind of talked about some of the EMG stuff that they found when they kind of just put a couple different EMGs throughout different parts of the body on different musculature, just to kind of see where the majority of the muscle activation was coming from. So those are kind of the components of the golf swing and some of the things that are important. Moving forward, now when we talk about being able to improve performance and power, we have to think about the fact that power it can be defined a bunch of different ways, right? It can be defined as explosive strength. It can be defined as the force times the velocity, right? The time rate of doing work, those equations, power equals work over time, and being able to do an amount of work in a condensed amount of time. So when we're trying to understand power and being able to utilize that with golfers, we want to also make sure that we're taking into account the shortening cycle, right? You have the concentric phase, the amortization phase, and then the eccentric phase, that those are going to be key to be able to kind of make sure that we're really allowing our golfers to transfer that power and transfer that force, through their body up the kinetic chain into the club head and then back down through acceleration and contact into the follow through of the golf swing. And Pilates and potentiation is something that I think can be good as well. What does this mean for the golfer? This means being able to incorporate some Pilates work as maybe a little bit of some neuromuscular re-education, or an opportunity to just kind of give like some proprioceptive feedback in terms of where their pelvis is in space. Are they able to kind of disassociate the upper extremities from the trunk, or the lower extremities from the trunk, or the upper half, the upper quarter of the body from the lower quarter? And being able to then add in a little bit of complex training where there may be some Pilates intervention, and then there's also some weightlifting, and then we're doing a plyometric drill as well, right? For that potentiation to really kind of help improving the power, because lower body power has been associated with club head speed in golf. And so that's a big thing that we kind of want to look at. Moving on, lower back injuries, and just understanding what we're up against from a standpoint of just like some everyday injuries and pathologies that we're going to see with this population. That way, we kind of know how to be able to uh, make sure that our interventions are catered to treat those specific pathologies and movement impairments. So underneath this picture of Adam Sandler and Happy Gilmore, you can kind of see the lower back injuries, and just talking about how they can result from repetitive strain, inefficient movement patterns, and poor swing mechanics. And these can kind of lead to chronic low back pain. And a lot of the time, and actually, the Strength and Conditioning Association, one of their people that does a lot of research and articles for them, found that lower back pain can account to up to 52% of the injuries that are seen in golf. So when you think about that, it's just essentially half of the people that come in to see you that are golfers, they're probably dealing with some kind of lower back pain, and you kind of think about that from a standpoint of them being able to be in their golf stance and just doing that over 9 holes, 18 holes, like that can be a lot of an ask on some of the postural and global stabilizers of the back. And so lower back injuries is something that we're gonna kind of talk through and um, see some interventions and things that would be beneficial for that population. Now, shoulder and hip injuries are another common set of injuries that you'll see. And with the hip injuries, a lot of time you'll see this in more of your senior kind of patients, or your senior golfers. And what tends to happen is that from the standpoint of the golf swing, like let's say, well, for me, I'm right-handed. So let's say I'm a right-handed golfer. My trail limb, or my trail leg, is actually my right leg, and my lead leg is going to be my left leg. Because if you think about it, as I come from downswing through acceleration, through follow through, and I'm decelerating, then what's going to happen is that left side is what's leading me as I go into that rotational uh, component of the swing, and also kind of rotating around that lead leg or that left leg, the leg that's closer towards the direction of the target or where the golf ball will be translating to. From a standpoint of shoulder injuries, a lot of rotator cuff related shoulder pain. Um, Personally, my bias, I don't like to use subacromial impingement or that terminology. So I kind of like to categorize it in the rotator cuff related shoulder pain category. Bursitis, overuse syndromes, things like that, just from this repetitive swinging of the golf club. So now, some key limitations in golf. The first one's going to be decreased trunk and hip rotation. And I mean, if you kind of think about just from a standpoint of where the rotation is happening and just kind of how things are transferring throughout the kinetic chain, you can see how tightness, joint restrictions, and poor flexibility, are going to be culprits that kind of uh, play a factor essentially in decreased performance as well as some of the injuries that occur. Poor postural control is another one, right? If you've never golfed, speaking, and this is me speaking from personal experience, I am not a natural golfer. Like I didn't grow up playing golf. I grew up playing other sports. So when I got into golf, I quickly realized how much of my postural muscles, the erectors and multifidi, just how important that they are just from a standpoint of getting into my golf stance, and how after doing that repetition after repetition after repetition, can kind of weigh on you, and kind of lead to some malalignment, because you're kind of trying to shift your leg, like your weight from one side to the other, or you're trying to tilt your pelvis in one particular direction as well. And you can kind of see just like how the poor postural control can be something as well that um, is a culprit in terms of something that we can work on, and something that can kind of decrease performance from the golfer's standpoint. And then next, obviously, muscular weakness, right? So when we get into the EMG research, I'm going to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about just some of the major musculature that the EMGs showed that were the most active throughout the golf swing, because that will kind of it gives us like a bread trail as far as what musculature we can kind of be focusing on from a standpoint of rehab and from a standpoint of just like overall performance as well. And then lastly, kind of a little redundancy, but just like mobility issues, right? Which kind of correlates with the decreased trunk and hip rotation, but just like overall mobility in through the hips and in through the thoracic spine. I often tell golfers that, just by doing some of the Pilates stuff and incorporating some of those things, we can add some extra levels of thoracic rotation or just thoracic mobility to your spine that adds another 10, 20 yards on your drive when you're swinging. So now, getting into Pilates and that side of things. So Pilates, there are a couple different principles that come to mind when I think about Pilates. And some of those include like your breath work, so breathing, alignment, obviously, because you want to be in optimal alignment to be able to generate the most force, as well as being able to have control, which goes back to some of that postural control we were talking about before. And then other key principles, I would say, mobility and movement integration, which is being able to take the breath work, take the alignment, take the control, and take the mobility and put that all together to be able to provide patients and these athletes with a positive movement experience, so to speak, and give them an opportunity to be able to put everything together so that they can improve their performance. A lot of time, I think people think when it comes to Pilates, like, oh yeah, it's stretching, right? And while there are components of stretching and components of mobility, I think that it's a lot more than that. And it's a lot more than the other stigma as well of, oh, Pilates, it's just pure abdominal work, or it's just pure abs, or it's pure core. And when they say core, they mean just pure abs, right? And we as clinicians know better than to think of the core as just being, the rectus abdominis or the TA or the obliques, right? But it's also composed of the multifidi and, the back stabilizers, as well as, some of the musculature that attaches into the hip and pelvic floor. And right, like it's a lot more than just the abdominal cavity that makes up that concept or that word core. So a lot of times with Pilates, a beautiful thing with it is that it's not only just a matter of working mobility, but it can be working strength, it can be working breath work, alignment, some of the things we talked about. But the thing that I would say that's underrated that I think is most important is just being able to provide people with that body awareness. Because how can I correct something in my body if I can't even make the connection that something is off, or make the connection that, you know, I am not as aligned or balanced as I thought that I was. So now, how does Pilates enhance golf performance? So we're going to talk about a couple different things. The first one, TA stability. So thinking about the TA as a natural core set and just providing stability to pelvis and lower back during the golf swing. Multifidi, you know, kind of thinking of the multifidi in the same way that we think of like the rotator cuff at the shoulder, right? Just kind of being like that stabilizer, of the low back and that stability muscle for the back. Now, with the diaphragm and breathing, a lot of the time I like to incorporate diaphragmatic breathing, but also just good inhale and exhale work where these people, these patients, these golfers are being made aware of the fact that they may be doing a lot of accessory breathing. And a lot of their breathing may be coming, through their neck, through their scalenes, right? And sternocleidomastoid, and not being able to really understand the potential that they have of being able to improve their performance just by being able to have better breathing, or just a more efficient breathing pattern. So being able to breathe, and sending the ribs in an anterior posterior translation, as well as being able to send it out laterally, right? And being able to really use the diaphragm and playing with certain things where we may do something as simple as child's pose and having them focus on taking a big inhale and sending that air in through the right side of their body into their right rib cage, and being able to kind of play with those kind of things to help them understand how to use their breath in a bigger capacity. The anti-rotation is just from a standpoint of when you think about going through those phases of the golf swing, utilizing your controlled stability in order to kind of have like some controlled mobility as well, and rotating in a way where you're still on plane and you're not all over the place. And then endurance for performance, that just kind of goes back to some of the postural stuff that we were talking about, the stabilizers, where they come into play, bringing that awareness again of, certain interventions from a Pilates standpoint. I may have someone do something as simple as laying down supine and then bringing their legs into what we call tabletop position, which is just like that kind of 90 degree position. And then being able to show them that, you know, they use a lot of their hip flexors in that, right? And you'll kind of see it because their knees will be kind of favoring towards their chest, and I kind of have to pull them out of that a little bit so that there's a little bit more, one, disassociation, and two, just stability, and not using any compensatory hip flexion to keep them in that position, which also can kind of help when we start biasing some things in terms of like core work. And then from the kinetic transfer dynamics, again, just the movement integration principle that I was speaking about earlier, just being able to put it all together to kind of help them generate more power and more control in through their swings as well. So now we're going to kind of look at some research before we get into some of the interventions. So one of the articles that will be in the resources and the citation sources at the end of the presentation. The article went over just some EMG findings that there were in the golf swing, and just kind of being able to understand like the muscle activation patterns. Again, just so we know like the role of these muscles in the golf swing. So looking at the study, and it's interesting actually because synthesizing just like different research articles, the overarching theme that I found was that the EMG studies revealed that the muscles that were almost always mostly activated throughout the swing included the glute group. So glute, well, more not glute min, but more glute max and glute med were seen as being prevalent. The rhomboids were seen as being prevalent as well. Erector spinae, of course, the obliques, multifidi, and also going down into the lower extremity, they also saw a lot of biceps femoris activation as well as vastus lateralis, and it's just, to me, it's always interesting kind of reading these EMG studies because you kind of assume that one group of musculature will be the most involved, or one muscle will kind of be the culprit as the one that's being the most activated. And then you kind of see how there's all these other different muscles that are involved that have a high rate of activity as well. So thinking about that from a standpoint of power and being able to translate power into the golfer's swing, you can think about the fact that if you're able to effectively strengthen the glute complex, those hip extensors, and strengthening the some of the postural stabilizers at the back, as well as some of the rotator cuff musculature, retractors. Oh, sorry, pec major was also another one that they found. Pec major was more prevalent though as they were coming down in through the downswing and in through acceleration. My guess is probably just because of the uh, adduction that was happening in the internal rotation as well at the shoulder. I assume that that's why the pecs were a little bit more active there. But these are all some of the musculature and some of the muscles that you can kind of look at from a standpoint of looking up and down the kinetic chain to think about, you know, well, where should I start? Or what areas can I kind of focus on or add as like an accessory strengthening mobility or whatever the case may be to help with performance. Now, on another study, there were a couple of different groups. There was a group that was more so catered to just mat Pilates interventions. There was a group that was catered towards strengthening, like just general, typical strengthening work. The research wasn't very precise in terms of, you know, did they do deadlifts? Did they do rows? Like it didn't really break that down. It was just kind of generalized. But essentially, there was a mat Pilates group, there was a Pilates and strengthening group, and then the last group was a combination of just like general strengthening and some other work. And when they looked at it and they kind of looked at just like the muscle activation and just like the improvements, and these were for people with chronic low back pain. But when they looked at the improvements, they saw that the primary Pilates group that they had adaptations in terms of the musculature from a standpoint of their obliques, from a standpoint of their erector spinae, as well as the multifidi. So another great example of how some of those muscles can be really targeted through Pilates and how being able to incorporate stability and power with those muscles can really help enhancing trunk rotation and just overall power. And then lastly, insights into the X factor and spine control. So this is kind of a synthesis of multiple articles. And X factor, for those of you who may not know what that is, X factor is just a way to refer to separation of the hip and shoulder during the swing, or ultimately just upper extremity or upper quarter disassociation from lower quarter disassociation, or just being able to disassociate the trunk from the pelvis. And they found that there was a correlation where the golfers that had a decreased X factor, so the golfers that were unable to kind of disassociate the pelvis and the hips from the shoulder, they had more of a prevalence of low back pain. And so again, now we're kind of seeing how this X factor situation and just like the movement integration, the alignment, the things like that, how they all blend together, right? And studies show that Pilates training can improve this separation, not necessarily purely through a golf standpoint, but just the body and postural awareness that Pilates can improve, as well as just the disassociation factor that Pilates can improve, which can help also contribute to more effective golf swings. So this picture here is a picture of me doing an exercise called the semicircle. And basically, with this intervention on the reformer, we place our heels up on the foot bar, and then I kind of wiggle my body all the way out to where I can try and straighten my arms out as much as I can. And then from here, I bring myself up into a bridge. As I come up into the bridge, I press the carriage out to extend. And once I extend, I'm sending like a ripple pattern through my body. So it's basically a little bit of some of that disassociation because you'll see my pelvis will go into a posterior tilt and ripple down my body. And then I will reverse it coming back, sending an anterior tilt. And it's basically just moving through this rotation at the pelvis, but also just like some of the articulation through the spine as well. And so this is one of my favorite exercises to kind of use with not just my golfers, but even just some of my low back pain patients that can tolerate it because of the fact that it really emphasizes some of that disassociation at the pelvis. Now, we're going to get into some of the key Pilates exercises for golfers. And that, um, one of the things that we are going to talk about, oops, what did I just do? Okay, there we go. Okay. So one of the exercises that we're going to talk about right here, this is an exercise called breathing. And so breathing is an exercise that I also love because, again, just going back to the EMG studies, right? We know that the glutes, glute max, glute med, we know that biceps femoris, so part of the hamstring complex, is something that is heavily activated. And so with this breathing exercise, essentially in my hands, I have this wooden dowel that's connected to the springs that have tension. And my feet are up on this little platform here. And I can put my feet up at the very top, or I can put them inside of the little fuzzy cuffs. I put them up on top because it's going to require more stability and more postural control, as opposed to the little fuzzy cuffs kind of work more as a hammock. So my feet are a little bit more supported. But essentially, I'm going to start flat, and starting flat with my legs at an incline, and my hands are, or my arms and my shoulders are at 90 degrees with the springs on no tension. I inhale through my nose to extend and come up into this diagonal position, and exhale as I bring my arms down towards my torso. And I go through my inhales and exhales as I just go through repetitive flexion and extension at the shoulders, just trying to maintain as well that hip extension and to add a challenge to it. If I wanted to progress, I could take one of my legs away and have that leg floating in tabletop and just focus on being able to get more activation through the contralateral side. Or another way to progress it is, instead of having this wooden dowel that gives me support, I can attach the springs individually to some cuffs that go into my hand. And now I'm having to practice even more stability because I have to try and keep equal weight distribution between my right and my left. So this is breathing. It's a great exercise for um, the hip extension, a great exercise for the breathing as well, just really understanding the big inhales and the big exhales to kind of help just maintaining that diagonal and keeping the extension. And just a good exercise from a standpoint of just like postural control as well. Now, these are some other key Pilates exercises that I like to incorporate. And this first one here on the left is an exercise that we call quadruped. And basically, you start with the reformer all the way in. And I'm sorry, guys. I tried to put the videos in, but the formatting just wasn't being friendly to it. But you start with the carriage all the way in, and you have them in alignment where the shoulders are aligned over the wrists and the hips are aligned over the knees. Your heels will be up against the little shoulder blocks on the reformer, and you find that neutral position of your spine. Now, from here, you hinge back from the hips and knees, sending the carriage back while maintaining the shoulders over the wrist. And once you feel like you can no longer keep the shoulders over the wrist, and you've reached that maximal point of that hinging back from the hips and the knees, you then hinge back from the shoulders as far as you can go. And then you hinge back forward from the hips and knees, and then hinge back forward from the shoulders. So this is a great exercise that I like to use just from a perspective again of disassociation, right? So talking or alluding back to that X factor component that we discussed earlier, right? Like, what does that look like? Being able to get them to understand how they can disassociate their hips and knees from their trunk, or how they can disassociate their shoulders from their trunk. And this exercise is a hard one, right? But it's very telling because people will tell you, just like a lot of the exercises and interventions we have our patients do, they'll kind of tell you, like where their struggle is just by how they're moving their body, right? A lot of times, something that I see a lot of is just like trying to get them to hinge back from the hips and knees without moving at the shoulders as well. It's like a foreign concept, right? And it's a difficult thing for them to do. But when you think about the standpoint of how we talked about how some of that back pain can come from that decreased X factor, right? Or that decreased ability to disassociate the pelvis from the shoulders, or the lower quarter from the upper quarter, then you see why this is important. The top exercise where I have the blue shorts on, this is something honestly that I kind of just did like on the spot. This is it is this pose is what we call long stretch. But what I did with this is as I translate back, as I send the carriage back from my shoulders and I get to that max point, I rotate my pelvis over to the right. I come back to the center and I rotate over to the left. So on this picture, you can see that I'm a little bit more rotated over towards the right side. So I think this was probably like either mid rotation or beginning of the rotation. And then just being able to help them with that rotational component. Again, thinking about how that transfer up the kinetic chain happens in through the shoulders and to the club head to be able to come back down for the swing. And then right below that is an exercise called teaser, where the springs essentially can give you more support if you need. And the springs in Pilates, there's different colors, but just for context, I did this on a yellow spring, which yellow is the lightest. So because it's the lightest spring, when I'm coming from a completely supine position to kind of come up into like this V position, which I come up even more, but this was just like at the beginning parts of the movement. But because the springs are lighter, it's going to require me to use a lot more of my breath and a lot more of, my musculature in through the core, but also being able to get them to understand with this exercise, they start leading from the crown of their head, articulating up through the spine and come up. And as they go down, they lead with their pelvis, articulating, laying all the way back down. So this is also some more disassociation. And then the last one on the right is an exercise commonly known as saw. But here on the trapeze table, this is a circumduction exercise, which basically I keep myself centered between those two parallel bars and I am rotating my spine around through extension and back through flexion, just kind of working on some of that rotational mobility. So this is one that you can do without the actual equipment. And the teaser one at the bottom, you can do something called the Pilates hundreds, which I'd be happy to like talk to you guys more about this stuff outside of here because I know we're kind of like on a time crunch. And then frequency and structure. So research has shown 2 to 3 times a week for Pilates over an 8-week cycle is a pretty good timeline in terms of being able to see progress from a standpoint of strength and flexibility. Doesn't mean that you won't see it sooner. It's just the general consensus in research. And then I like to say, I like integrating it with strength training. So again, that potentiation via complex training to incorporate Pilates, weightlifting, and plyometrics, right? Because ultimately being able to do the power type things and the strengthening type things, it's what's going to help us be able to um, do more work in a shorter amount of time, hence increasing the power. And then these are just some metrics that matter for golfers. So club head speed that influences the shot distance, the spin rate that kind of is a little bit more intertwined with the rate of rotation of the ball. The handicap, which is just kind of telling you their strokes below or above par. Uh, Lower handicap golfers are more skilled compared to higher. And then there's a correlation that's been found in the handicap, being decreased, also showing that there's some increased club head speed and improved efficiency there. So overall key takeaways and gems. Pilates can improve upper and lower extremity disassociation, the X factor, the breath, the mobility, these things. This is also like a golf swing exercise that I do, and I show people on the equipment as well, that I have found to be a good one as well. I forget who actually taught me this one, but this was a great exercise that I like to use just from a rotational standpoint, and being able to also incorporate some stability in there. And then reducing injury risk, right? We see that incorporating Pilates can kind of help as well from a standpoint of being able to help with decreasing back pain, decreasing some of the stuff at the hip, right? Research, I forgot to mention as well, also kind of talked about the fact that there can be, or they found that there's a high correlation with decreased lead trail hip rotation, which means that's something you want to look at too, because they found that the compensatory pattern that happened from the decreased lead hip internal external rotation was compensatory movement through pelvis kinematics, posterior anterior tilt, which you can kind of think of how that can play a factor in some of the back pain we talked about before. And then it's something that you can integrate seamlessly with the rehab, right? This picture right here, she's in that position that I was telling you guys about before with the um tabletop. The only thing that I would say for her is just like I can kind of see it looks like she has a little bit of an arch in her spine. So I would probably want to get her into more neutral. And what I was saying before is you can kind of see, depending on where their hips are, if they're very like hip flexor dominant, or they just like use hip flexion as a compensatory pattern for not having, the adequate control or strength, as you will, in their stabilizers. And so that is the presentation. If you guys would like to connect with me afterwards, here's my email here, drcarlbourne@gmail.com. Feel free to also follow me on Instagram. I've been posting a lot more Pilates stuff over the last couple months. People have asked, and so I started making that content. So feel free to connect with me there. LinkedIn, I'm Karl Bourne Jr. And I love being able to connect with people and talk about these things. And then these are just some of the references. There's a lot of research out there in terms of golf, and in terms of Pilates as well. But I would say that I would like to see there be more research from a standpoint of how Pilates can really factor into sports performance. And hopefully I'm in talks with someone about being able to possibly do some of that research. So hopefully, we can get that going, and then one of these days in the future, I'll be able to kind of come to you guys with some findings from a standpoint of sports performance and some of the measures and stuff like that that we took in order to, um, kind of further the narrative around how Pilates can be influential and beneficial from a perspective of sports performance. So, yeah, that is the presentation. I thank you guys for hopping on. And then let me, where will I be able to access? So you'll be able to access the recording later in the learning center. So it'll be placed in the learning center. I'm not sure how soon they'll put it up, but as soon as I click stop recording, it'll start downloading, and then they'll have access to it, and then it'll be in the APTA Learning Center for the sports section. So you'll be able to find it in there. And I know it's like 8:59 on the dot. I'm sorry I didn't leave a lot of time for uh Q&A, but if there's any questions, please like feel free to drop in the chat. If not, you guys have a wonderful night. Please connect with me. Would love to know what you guys are doing or ways that I can help you incorporate some of this stuff, because it doesn't have to be with the equipment, right? It's just a lot of the pictures and stuff, like you see me using the equipment because I have access to it, right? But if you don't have those resources, there's ways to get the same benefits using mats as well. So I thank you guys, and it doesn't look like there are any questions. So I will let you guys get out of here, and you have a wonderful night, and I hope this was informative and helpful. So thank you guys for coming. Have a great night. Bye.